In March 2026, a single bottle of French wine sold at auction for $812,500. Not a case. One bottle, a 1945 Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, from a region of France where premium vineyard land can be worth more than $2 million an acre. And the strangest part of that story is not the price. It's that the growers who make this wine are legally required by French law to deliberately produce less of it than their land is capable of, cutting down and discarding perfectly healthy grapes in the name of quality. In Burgundy, scarcity is not a side effect of the wine business. Scarcity is the product engineered into the system at every level, from the vine in the ground to the paperwork that follows the bottle to auction. The underlying constraint starts with geography and gets locked in place by law. Burgundy's most prized vineyards sit on narrow bands of limestone-rich hillside, a patchwork of individual plots called climates, some barely a few acres in size, subdivided over centuries of inheritance among multiple owners under France's Napoleonic Code, which requires land to be split equally among heirs rather than passed down whole. That single inheritance law, more than any winemaking decision, is why a single hillside can have dozens of separate owners today. The vineyards themselves are so historically significant that UNESCO inscribed the climates of Burgundy as a World Heritage Site in 2015, the first time a wine landscape had been recognized specifically for that patchwork of small, individually named parcels. On top of that fragmentation, French appellation law caps the maximum yield permitted per hectare for each classified vineyard, with the most prestigious Grand Cru sites held as some of the strictest limits of all. Growers are legally required to plant vines at extremely high density, commonly 10,000 or more per hectare, packing them close enough that each plant competes hard for a small footprint of thin, stony soil, deliberately stressing the vine because low yield and physical struggle are believed to concentrate flavor into the fruit. When a healthy vintage naturally produces more grapes than the legal ceiling allows, growers don't get to simply sell the extra. In a practice called the green harvest, they walk their own rows in midsummer and cut down perfectly ripe, healthy clusters, leaving them to rot on the ground, purely so the vine's remaining energy concentrates into a smaller, legally compliant crop. It is one of the only industries on Earth where a producer, mid-season, deliberately destroys a portion of a healthy product before it can ever be sold. If a grower somehow still ends up over the limit at harvest, the excess wine cannot legally be sold under the appellation name at all. It has to be distilled into industrial alcohol, sold for essentially nothing, the wine equivalent of a manufacturer melting down a product it's not allowed to put on shelves. Regulators, not the market, decide how much of this harvest is even allowed to exist as Burgundy in the first place. The other engineering constraint here is a legal ban, not a technological one. Self-propelled mechanical grape harvesters exist and are widely used across the rest of the wine world, moving through a vineyard in a fraction of the time hand-picking requires, shaking ripe clusters loose and sorting them on the move. In Burgundy's top appellations, they are prohibited outright, a restriction the region's own growers lobbied to have written into law, specifically to preserve hand harvesting as part of the wine's identity and its price. During drought years, when other agricultural regions would simply irrigate, French law bans watering these vineyards almost entirely, forcing vines to survive purely on whatever moisture the season provides, even through record-breaking summer heat. In an industry where nearly every other crop on Earth is being engineered for higher yield, lower labor, and more consistent output, Burgundy has legislated the opposite on purpose, treating restriction itself as a form of quality control. There is one piece of hidden engineering that keeps every vine alive at all, and almost no visitor ever notices it. Look closely at the base of a Burgundy vine, and you'll find a swollen scar, an omega-shaped graft where French wood was fused onto American rootstock. In the late 1800s, an aphid-like insect called phylloxera arrived from North America and nearly destroyed European wine entirely, feeding on vine roots and wiping out vineyards across the continent within decades, an agricultural catastrophe severe enough that some estimates put the destruction at well over half of France's vineyard land. The solution that saved French wine wasn't a pesticide, it was grafting. French grape varieties, prized for their fruit, fused permanently onto resistant American rootstock, immune to the insect underground. Essentially, every classic French vine alive today, including every plant behind that $800,000 bottle, is standing on foreign roots stitched together in a nursery, a graft repeated by hand on every single vine, every single time an old block is replanted, a century-and-a-half-old repair that has simply become permanent infrastructure. Specialist grafting nurseries, licensed and inspected under French plant health law, propagate certified rootstock and budwood by the hundreds of thousands of vines a year specifically to keep this ongoing repair supplied, an entire agricultural industry that exists solely to keep replanting Burgundy on borrowed roots, generation after generation, with no end date in sight. Harvest itself becomes a race against a narrow ripeness window, done entirely by hand, crews of pickers moving down each row at the exact moment sugar and acid balance peaks, because grapes picked even a few days early or late measurably change the character of the finished wine. Fruit is hand-sorted at the vineyard edge on portable tables, and again at the winery door on a second sorting line, culling anything damaged, underripe, or touched by rot before a single grape is crushed, all under time pressure, because grapes begin oxidizing and losing quality within hours of being cut from the vine in warm weather. On the most prestigious estates, that sorting can happen berry by berry rather than cluster by cluster, a labor cost that would be economically unthinkable for almost any other agricultural product on Earth. What actually happens to that fruit next is a system most bottle labels never explain. Because so many individual growers own only a sliver of a single climate, often not enough grapes to justify their own winery, press, and barrel cellar. A parallel structure of negociant houses has existed in Burgundy for centuries, buying grapes, unfinished must, or young wine in bulk from dozens of small growers, then vinifying, blending, aging, and bottling it under the negociant's own label. A bottle that says Burgundy on the front may never have been made, start to finish, by the family whose name appears anywhere on it, and two bottles from the same tiny vineyard made by two different negociants from grapes bought off two different rows can taste and cost meaningfully differently. It is an industrial supply chain hiding behind a label built to look like a single-family farm, and understanding which is which, grower-produced versus negociant-assembled, is one of the more consequential and least understood distinctions in the entire wine trade. Even getting access to the wine in the first place runs on a system closer to rationing than retail. Most top domains don't sell their best bottles to the highest bidder at release at all. Instead, they allocate a fixed tiny number of bottles each vintage to a short list of importers and restaurants, relationships built up over decades, sometimes generations, meaning a buyer with unlimited money but no history with the estate can still be turned away entirely, while a modest restaurant with a decades-old relationship receives its usual handful of bottles. That allocation list is effectively a closed network money alone cannot buy into, which is a large part of why the price the public actually sees. The auction price is often set years later on a secondary market, several ownership changes removed from the domain that made the wine in the first place, and completely detached from whatever modest release price the original allocation holder actually paid. That value concentration has created a security problem most industries would never have to solve. As 6- and 7-figure bottles became common at auction, Burgundy also became one of the most actively counterfeited categories of wine on Earth, a problem serious enough that a single fraud case involving fabricated old and rare Burgundy defrauded collectors out of tens of millions of dollars before it collapsed. In response, top domains now engineer anti-counterfeiting measures directly into the bottle itself. Embedded microchips, tamper-evident capsules, laser-etched serial numbers, and proprietary security tags fused into the cork or capsule that auction houses scan and verify before a single lot goes under the hammer. A bottle of wine, at this level, now travels with the same kind of forensic authentication infrastructure built around currency or luxury handbags, because the price it can command has made faking it a genuinely profitable crime. Once a bottle is confirmed genuine, keeping it that way becomes its own logistics operation. Serious collections are held in temperature and humidity-controlled cellars, often underground, for the same passive stability that makes an old limestone quarry useful for cheese, because even small swings in temperature can push wine in and out of the cork over years, slowly ruining it. Before a bottle goes to auction, specialists assess fill level, label condition, and cork integrity, since a bottle that has lost too much volume through a slowly failing cork is worth a fraction of an identical one that hasn't, regardless of what's actually inside. High-value collections carry dedicated insurance policies, and serious buyers increasingly demand a documented chain of custody, a paper trail proving exactly which cellars a bottle has passed through since it left the Domaine, because provenance gaps are exactly where counterfeit bottles have historically been laundered into an otherwise legitimate sale. Even in a region built around restriction, almost nothing goes to waste. Grape skins, seeds, and stems left over after pressing, known as pomace, are traditionally distilled into marc, a strong regional spirit, turning the physical leftovers of an already scarce harvest into yet another product to sell. And the wine that does get legally distilled for exceeding yield caps doesn't just disappear either. It's converted into industrial and pharmaceutical-grade alcohol. One more example of a system engineered to extract value from every drop, even the drops it isn't allowed to bottle. Barrels themselves cycle through a second economy. Once they're too old to age premier wine in, retired Burgundy barrels get sold onto distilleries, other wine regions, or even furniture makers, so that even the oak casks eventually find a second life once their flavor-giving years are spent. Economically, this entire structure functions as a legally sanctioned scarcity machine, restricting yield, banning machinery, banning irrigation, fragmenting ownership down to the row, and mandating punishing vine density all suppress supply relative to what the land could otherwise produce. And in a market with strong growing global demand for the most famous names, suppressed supply is precisely what pushes auction prices for a single bottle past the price of a house. Meanwhile, that pressure is not evenly distributed. Elsewhere in France, outside these elite appellations, oversupply and falling consumption have pushed the European Union and the French government to pay growers to permanently rip out tens of thousands of acres of ordinary vineyard in programs aimed at regions producing wine. Nobody wants to buy at any price, a stark split screen. Some of the most valuable agricultural land on Earth deliberately restricting output a few hundred miles from vineyards being paid to disappear entirely because the market has more of that wine than it will ever need. None of this runs without a workforce that is almost entirely seasonal and increasingly hard to find. Harvest alone can require thousands of temporary pickers descending on the region for a matter of weeks, historically French students and local labor, increasingly international workers recruited specifically for the harvest window, housed and fed by estates for the handful of days the ripeness window actually allows. Coopers, the craftsmen who hand-build the oak barrels these wines age in, remain one of the few genuinely irreplaceable trades left in the process, bending staves over open flame using techniques barely changed in generations, because the exact toast level of a barrel measurably shapes the wine sealed inside it for the next year or more. Cellar masters then spend that year tasting, blending, and racking wine barrel by barrel, a job that still depends on trained human palates, because no instrument yet replaces a taster who can catch a fault before it ruins an entire vintage. Underneath all that tradition, growers now quietly run a layer of precision monitoring that would look at home on a modern commodity farm. Networks of small weather stations track temperature, humidity, and frost risk row by row, because a single spring frost can wipe out a majority of a Grand Cru's entire annual output in one cold night, and early warning is often the only defense available. Soil probes log moisture at multiple depths even though the vines can't legally be watered, giving growers exact data on drought stress they are still forbidden from correcting directly. Some estates now fly drones over their rows to map vine vigor from the air, spotting disease or stress patterns invisible from the ground, then send pickers into those specific rows first when harvest begins. None of it changes the legal restrictions the region operates under: hand harvest, no irrigation, capped yield, But it means decisions about exactly when to declare the bon de vendange, the official start of picking, are increasingly informed by sensor data layered on top of a tasting. A winemaker has done the same way for generations. Looking ahead, the system faces a genuine contradiction. Climate change is pushing summer temperatures higher and rainfall less predictable, and harvest dates across Burgundy have already shifted dramatically earlier than they were a few generations ago, with some recent vintages picked in August, a month or more ahead of the historical norm, as heat pushes sugar levels up faster than growers can react. The same laws that manufacture Burgundy's scarcity, particularly the near-total irrigation ban, leave growers with almost no legal tool to manage drought stress the way farmers everywhere else on the planet routinely do. Pressure is building inside the wine industry itself to loosen those irrigation rules, but any change threatens the exact legal framework of restriction and hardship that gives the wine its story and, by extension, its price. Burgundy has to decide whether surviving a changing climate is worth risking the scarcity that makes an 80-year-old bottle worth more than most people's houses. And underground, the same insect that forced the original graft a century and a half ago has never actually been eliminated, only contained by rootstock resistance. It still lives in Burgundy's soil today, permanently, which means every vine in the region depends indefinitely on a graft that cannot ever be safely removed. It is easy to see a wine list price and assume it's simply about age or prestige. But behind that number sits a century of law engineered specifically to produce less, not more, grapes deliberately cut and left to rot, a fractured patchwork of ownership held together by negotiant houses most drinkers never notice, forensic security tags fighting a counterfeiting trade worth tens of millions of dollars, vines legally forbidden from being watered even in a drought, and a harvest still done entirely by hand because the growers themselves fought to keep it that way. That is the quiet complexity behind almost everything on a supermarket shelf, or in this case, an auction house. If you want more stories behind the world's most valuable crops, consider subscribing.